All right. So good afternoon. All right. The title of the course was John Stuart Mill and Utilitarianism. And the way I envisage doing this is spending this session on utilitarianism and devoting the next session to John Stuart Mill and his particular versions of it. All right. So, but to place utilitarianism in a wider context, let's step back a bit and first say, well, what is it that philosophy does? All right. And then let's place ethics in the context of philosophy, just to get an overall view. So philosophy is a reflection and exploration of the meaning of our experience, individual, cultural, historical, collective, and personal. Right? So it's an exploration of the questions of meaning, ultimately meaning of truth, and the meaning of any aspects of our experience as we explore and develop it. Kant phrased 4 questions as a summary of philosophy, 4 basic questions that needed to be addressed. Kant's 4 questions were, what can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? And what is man? I would translate that now in a more updated version to what is human nature. And I think perhaps really in a deeper sense, you might even say, what is life in a wider context? And those 4 questions spell out the field so-called of logic and epistemology on the one hand, the field of ethics, what can I do? Secondly, the field of religion, and you might say aspects of metaphysics on the third, and the field of anthropology in its widest sense, in the last sense. And all of that presupposes some sense, not spelled out in the question, is what is existence? Right? Heidegger phrased it as, why is there being rather than nothing? But the assumption is an exploration of meaning and significance of what there is. What is there and what is its meaning of significance, right? So those are the 4 questions in Kant's development of his comprehensive critical philosophy. He devotes each one of the 3 major critiques, each one of those first 3 questions, essentially. Critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, then the critique of judgment, along with religion within the bounds of reason alone. It constitutes the edifice, you might say, of Kant's philosophical corpus. Right? But so what we're dealing with now here is only one aspect of that wider conception. We're dealing with the question of meaning, philosophical exploration of issues of meaning, the meaning and significance of human life. We're focusing on that aspect of it which deals with human action. What shall we do? What should we do? And why? Right? That's generally the field of ethics. Right? In that field, right, there are many dimensions by which one can explore that dimension. There are many ways those questions have been addressed historically within the context of a human situation. Just to think of the most obvious in a Christian civilization is the Bible. The Bible being, for example, one specific version of it would be the 10 Commandments, right? Which is a way of telling you what you should do based on revelation from a divine being. There are other ways of interpreting the Bible and the Christian moral direction, but that is one way in which that issue has been addressed. Other ways in which the issue has historically been addressed, right? Inspiration or spiritual mystical insights or charismatic leadership. You might think of the current situation in the United States as a certain version of a kind of charismatic leadership. all right, insofar as there's a mobilization of organizations and individuals who take their direction from what their leader says. And that obviously is not unique to the United States. I mean, there was historical experience in the 20th century in which there's such a thing as a leader. Der Führer, for example, who was the source of moral direction as to what is right, wrong, and should be done. These are some examples of the way in which, right? And the more traditional ways would be ancestral, the way it has always been done, the way our ancestors did or continue to influence and direct us, or a certain kind of intuition, the intuition basically that we have a sense and we know what is right, maybe because of upbringing, or of the communities we're a part of. I mean, these are the normal historical and traditional ways that were developed and have developed in throughout the human history, from primitive times, as it were, to the present. And then we have the more systematic ones within the context of the traditional historical, certainly Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for example, who have their books. They're not alone, but they have, which are revealed truths, which are meant to tell us what is, how we should act. And more or less, these are the ways that more or less guided and directed human history throughout most of its time for most people. Right? But in the West, certainly, perhaps in different ways in India and in China, which we won't go into here, right? Rational inquiry began to develop alternative ways of trying to understand the human condition, to interpret it, as it were. You might say the philosophical development of meaning through inquiry, and sought, therefore, to develop coherent, rational interpretations of the way in which human beings should live. Right? And in the West, that has led to a series of distinct, rationally based and non-transcendent, non-intuitive, but you might say empirical and rationally developed ways of interpreting and answering the question, what shall I do? What shall we do? Usually in the Western philosophical tradition to the present day, that's generally seen as having three more or less coherent, though complex, distinct traditions, ways of addressing what shall I do and the justifications for it. Those three distinct traditions are, and I give them to you more or less in their historical order, as it were, what is often called virtue ethics. Then secondly, deontological ethics. And third, consequentialist ethics. Right? So, and utilitarianism is a version of consequentialist ethics. But let me say something more first about each of these other branches or alternatives. Let me get. I have something I want to use. If I can get it. I should have set this up before, not by mistake. But here we go. Good. Got it. Okay. So I want to start with the virtue ethics. That really is essentially the tradition that is associated most directly with Aristotle. Aristotle's Nicomachean and Eudaimonean ethics are examples of virtue ethics. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean a way of understanding the human situation and setting forth moral criteria or guidance as to how we should live and behave, which focuses on the development of character, focuses on the development of the character of individuals and communities. And for Aristotle, by the way, that is a close link up, all right? Namely, the link up between the character and possibilities of flourishing for an individual and the character and structure and resources of the community. It's extremely difficult, Aristotle feels, for an individual to flourish in a deteriorating or systematically destructive society. In order for true human development and human flourishing requires really a supportive and sustaining community which nourishes and nurtures that kind of development. I'm not going to go into an extensive discussion of Aristotle, but what becomes central then for Aristotle, of course, is the development of the character of individuals and the development of the virtues that are appropriate for a moral character. I mean, there are the classic so-called cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And there's a more elaborate development, the so-called doctrine of the mean, where virtues are, for Aristotle, a mean between extremes. And what I wanted to get was a table of virtues and vices from Aristotle's Eudaimonean ethics, almost identical in the Nicomachean ethics, two versions of it. But to give you a couple of examples, where we take, for example, some of the classic virtues. Bravery. It's a mean between cowardice, which is a deficiency, and foolhardiness, which is the rash over expression, all right? Or shame, which is the mean between thin-skinned oversensitivity, as it were, to the opinions of others, and shamelessness, lack of adequate and appropriate concern for the way one is with others in community. Or justice, right? Which means, in a more particular sense here, how one deals with the distribution of goods and services of a society, a more narrow definition of justice rather than the more inclusive one that Aristotle uses but is more central in the Platonic tradition. And that's seen as the virtue of deficiency, disadvantage, and the virtue of excess and gain and over appropriation of more than just is becoming to you. So there's a whole discussion and list of the different kinds of virtues that were celebrated in the Aristotelian time. And that sense of what is the appropriate way for a human to nurture human well-being is the central vision. And the Aristotelian perception more or less went into, I don't know, you might say, not central use, was not emphasized for much of the modern Western tradition until into the later part of the 20th century. There's been a revival of interest in Aristotelian conceptions of the importance of the virtues as central way of understanding what is moral in the human life and what are our obligations and responsibilities. One interesting version of that, by the way, is one developed by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, along with the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who were for a while a couple, who developed the capabilities approach to as a way of giving guidance and direction to international economic development activities. It's meant particularly really to deal with how to evaluate economic and social and cultural development activities in the third world, and trying to develop coherent strategies and criteria to give guidance and direction to international, oh, yeah, like that. Battery is running low. Is this not plugged in? I don't know. There may be a problem. Yeah, I know. It looks to me like it's plugged in. So it's plugged in here and it goes into there. Is that not plugged in? It's plugged in. So I don't know. It looks all plugged into me.
Do you need that screen?
Huh? Well, I don't know. Yes, there's someone on here, so I'm not sure what this is going to mean. We'll see what happens. I don't know. Fun and games. I'm not really sure because it looks to me like it's all plugged in. Oh,
Not plugged in.
it's not plugged in.
That's the power supply.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, that helped. I guess that was it. It came out. Thank you, Gina. Didn't, wasn't back in life. All right. So much for Aristotle. I just thought that was helpful, interesting to think about the way in which a philosophical conception of how to understand moral values developed essentially by Aristotle. And by the way, Martha Nussbaum, the earlier part of her career, was devoted as an expert on Aristotelian philosophy, and she's written about it. So she used that, working with Amartya Sen, who's an Indian economist and social theorist, who I believe, as I said, is a Nobel Prize winner for his work on these things, to develop strategies for giving guidance to contemporary cultural, economic, and social development issues, mostly in the third world. So it's called the capabilities approach. And it's interesting, very interesting, fascinating stuff. Anyway, but I use that as an example to show the relevance and potential usefulness and influence of that kind of conception of ethical thought. Secondly, I mentioned deontological. The deontological is a mode of thinking which prioritizes not character per se, right? It subordinates that to the notion of what is right, what is our obligation, what is our duty, right? The obligation, and this is in its classic form, most completely, it's the development of the thought of Immanuel Kant. I'm not going to go into great detail on Kant, but it's central of Kant's thought. What is central there is the notion of his categorical imperative and his notion that rational nature, right, it's widening beyond human nature to rational nature, deserves to be respected because of its intrinsic qualities. And rational nature then sets the law with respect to how human beings ought to behave. Right? I don't want to go into detail on that, but let me give you some other examples. I recently taught the course on Stoicism. The Stoics put tremendous emphasis on the importance of duty. And of course, the Romans put tremendous emphasis in the entire culture on the centrality of one's obligation and one's duty. Right? The notion of duty, the notion of obligation, the notion of right as being primary, that you have obligations, that's also built into the Christian tradition insofar as the Ten Commandments give you a set of rules which require you to respect and to live in accordance with them. Right? They set forth, therefore, moral obligations. So what in the case of the deontological ways of thinking, what is central is a moral obligation to do what is right. And of course, part of the question becomes, where do you get that conception of what is right? And clearly, as an example, in the Christian context, one aspect of it, or the Judaic context, it's the Ten Commandments and divine revelation, right? But there are other ways in which it can be understood in terms of some kind of insight into transcendent values, or insight into a fundamental structure of the nature of human rationality, as it is in some sense with Kant, right? But what this is the prioritization of your moral obligation to be right or just. Do what is right, though the heavens may fall. Consequences are not central, they're secondary. You have a moral obligation to keep your promises, to be fair and just to others. Those take priority in the context of deontological ways of understanding. And Kant puts it in his theory when he develops it. He says the only thing that is intrinsically good on its own right is the goodwill. And the goodwill is the will to do what reason dictates as the right. And that is the fundamental moral obligation of all human beings. And that involves, that's where you get the categorical imperative, which is basically that you should act in such a way that you could will the maxim of your act to be a universal law binding on all human beings. Act so that the maxim of your act could be a universal law binding on all human beings. You could claim and demand that every human being in a comparable situation ought to act in the same way. That's really what is central to the deontological. We'll often say the Kantian, since Kant was such a comprehensive thinker who really developed and fleshed out this mode of thinking at such an extreme version. All right. So, and that tends to be one of the two primary modes of ethical thought operative in the philosophical tradition at the present time. Right. Then the third, yes.
Isn't what you just said according to the golden rule? Do what you want others to do.
In a version, you can find that golden rule, as it were, in some version in almost every religion and culture across the world. And it is very similar to that. Of course, in the golden rule, it depends, what you want others to do. And that is itself an open question. Yeah. Kant, that's not an open question. It's what reason dictates in its intrinsic nature. So the obligation for Kant, and it's very important for Kant, that obligation is not empirically variable. It is universally applicable to all people. Now, we're not going to get into a discussion of Kant here and how he would flesh this out and what political and theoretical problems might be involved. So yes, you could say the golden rule is a certain practical application of it under certain conditions. All right, but the question of want is really for Kant derivative, because it doesn't really matter what you want. The obligation dictates to that want. In fact, Kant makes a big thing about the difference between our wants, our inclinations on the one hand, and our moral obligation on the other. In fact, that he sees those as a kind of tension. So that if you act out of something, out of satisfaction, if you act because you're inclined, if you act because of your motive, right, to please another, none of those are moral acts from Kant's point of view. There's only one reason an act can be moral, and that's because you do it because it's the right thing to do.
That just moves the question.
Huh?
That just moves the question.
Well, it moves the question is what constitutes the structure of the right, and that gets back to the very nature of what constitutes rationality. And Kant argues that rationality has a structure, and there's something intrinsic to it. which determines, which gives guidance and direction. But the one thing you can say about rationality is universalizability. So that whatever holds for you in this situation holds for you, and everyone else, or every other rational being. That's Kant's claim. Whether he can cash it in, as it were, if I may use a William James metaphor here, that's another question. Yes.
It seems like this is a justification for colonialism,
Why would you say that?
because as you move to a different culture, you're applying the universal obligation that's established within your culture.
That's a fascinating point, because you can take that from either or both ways, in the sense that you can take that as a claim that this is Western imperialism imposing itself on third world, or you can take it as a claim that universal, that we're treating the third world people as equally as anyone else, equally deserving of intrinsic respect because they are rational in their nature, and that rationality dictates that, and that therefore it is quite the opposite, right? And one expression of that would be something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in some sense comes out of a Kantian perspective, in some sense. I won't get too complicated about the historical developments, but what is a Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It is saying that all people, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or whatever, deserve to be treated with respect and with intrinsic dignity. That's very, you might say, Kantian. Right? It doesn't say anything about the consequences of that treatment. Did they earn it? Well, it's not in question. Right? They have a right to it because of their intrinsic nature as rational and human beings. Right? Is their behavior justifying it? That's irrelevant also from the Kantian perspective. So well, your point is well taken, because both positions have been taken and passionately taken in the modern world. And the question is the universalization of things, of Western philosophy intrinsically in itself imperialistic, colonializing, and you might say patriarchal, and well, that's a fascinating, interesting question. And there's a lot been written about that, and I don't want to suggest it's a simple or easy question to handle, but it is relevant in interesting ways to Kant too, who had a very mixed, complicated history with respect to colonialism and with respect to attitudes toward different races, and his views evolved over time too, under transformation. Again, Kant is a person of the 18th century, born in 1724 and dying in 1804. So he's right in the middle. He's really sort of the middle, you might say, in the culmination of what is often called the Enlightenment. And central to that. It's a complicated, interesting question. So let's just leave it as a good, excellent question with a question mark, and how you want to develop it. Yes.
Just on the question, how it dovetails with the golden rule. The problem with the golden rule, from Kant's point of view, in addition to the fact that it shouldn't be consequential, like you'll get anything back by doing it, but also when you say treat others the way you want to be treated, that relies on everybody wanting to be treated in a beneficent way. Some people want to be treated in a way that, isn't so cool.
Yeah.
So
Well,
you could treat somebody in a harassing way just because you kind of like being harassed, as a weird example.
Yeah.
So instead, Kant isn't interested in whether it's the way you want to be treated. He wants you to act in a way that is good. And
well,
he imagines that there's a way of defining good through logic.
yeah, well, it's intrinsic to the very nature of rational nature for Kant. It's what is intrinsic to what he understands as rational nature. Right. Yeah, but it is not related to what anyone would want about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's true. Right. Right. So now this was all meant to set the framework for utilitarianism. which is the classic version of what is often called consequentialism. There are wider versions of it. If we have sufficient time, I will get into some of the discussions of the complications with utilitarianism and the ways in which this can be developed and the ways in which it often can be criticized, right? But utilitarianism is then the third of the three major branches, you might say, of the modern rational approach to ethical theory. And I gave you a bunch of ways which are not rational approaches in our modern sense to ethical theory, but the three rational approaches, the primary ones, are the virtue ethics, the deontological ethics, virtue being linked to Aristotle, particularly deontological ethics being specifically linked to Kant, but also including Christianity and in so many versions, or Stoicism, and now the utilitarianism. Yes.
I gotta ask, I've been trying to keep my mouth shut.
No, go right ahead. I want you to
But
ask.
how does one function in this society? Or it's actually more than a society now, it's bigger than our country.
Right.
How does one function when rational thought is not working?
Right.
And it's being mocked or whatever, and you're here and half the world, it seems, is over there.
Yeah.
How do you function in that?
Well, let me give you my answer, okay? I mean, you know,
Please.
there's one thing is to set forth what ought to be the criteria by which we operate, right? And that's in some sense what ethical theory is trying to do, in part. Set forth what ought to be, I emphasize the word ought, to be the criteria by which I as an individual operate, by which our society ought to operate, by which the world at large ought to operate. And we would probably assume that the oughts go for all those equally, but there is a reason to say that maybe what I ought to do or you ought to do is different from what a group ought to do, or what this group versus that group. Going back to David's question a moment ago, it might be that, you know, what we ought to do in the West is not the same as what different cultures ought to do, insofar as we believe that they have their own unique ethnic traditions and ethic and moral perspectives, and we think that that is intrinsically valuable in their own right and ought to be respected to some extent. Okay? And those questions get complicated. That's one thing, namely to set forth the ideal. Then the second question is, ideals are ideals, right? They're not self-instituting, as it were, right? They constitute where we would like to be, where we should be, right? But then there's the question of where we are. And as a pragmatist, which is my philosophical orientation, particularly, which is, by the way, a version of consequentialism, which I'm not going to be talking about here, you have to then say, all right, now, where are we? How do we understand where we are? What the current situation is, which is always very complicated and very diverse, right? And almost invariably far away from the ideal. That's one of the very natures of the ideal, is usually quite different from where we are. That's what makes it ideal. Then the question is now, what can we do? You would assume that if, insofar as the ideal is something which makes a demand on you in some way, emotional, rational, etc., you say, well, I would like to move in that direction. How can I move in that direction? And then you get into the world of what is, whatever you want to call it, the practical action and implementation of ethical actions is to try and move in the direction of the ideal. I always like the way Dewey phrases that, John Dewey, that the ideal is not something one imposes on the world. That's always a disaster, to try to impose it. That becomes oppressive. The ideal is offered as a means to action. It is something which gives guidance and direction. So you know where you want to go, but it doesn't tell you how to get there or how you can even move in that direction. We never really get there anyway. It's a guide. And so the challenge is then to say, all right, to have the best adequate understanding that we can have to where we are at present. And then to say now, given that, what are the kinds of actions we as individuals and as groups and collectivities can engage in to move in that direction? Hopefully there is something that one can do, all right? How significant, etc. And at that point, you're in a situation where, well, do you feel there is anything? I mean, what is the nature of depression? Depression basically is the situation is blocked. If you feel there's nothing you can do, that is depressing, right? So to the extent to which you feel there are options and possibilities, that is invigorating, that is sustaining, that is guiding, right? And that's a challenge. And, and we don't have a choice as to when and where we live. That's the notion of what Heidegger calls the thrownness, the human condition. We find ourselves in a world not of our choosing. All right, we find ourselves much more than that. We find ourselves with a genetic makeup not of our choosing, with a parentage not of our choosing, with a culture and with a language, I mean, all of that is none of our choosing. I mean, we weren't, who chose to be born in America, in the United States in the late part, I guess here, the mid or late part of the 20th century, okay? As opposed to, I just saw something on the internet, the worst year, supposedly, historians say the worst year ever to have lived was 536 of the Common Era. This is one of the little things that came up in the news. I was just reading this morning. Why was that? Why was it? Well, there was a gigantic earthquake. No, there was not an earthquake, but volcano. And they didn't even spell out in this one where that volcano was. There was the famous Tambora volcano of 1816, and then you had the whole period of the summer with it. There was no summer really because of the effect it had on the climate. Of course, and if you go back to the whole discussion of the Earth, we know there are 5 major extinctions, and at least several of them probably came from those kind of collisions. The latest one with the dinosaurs at the Yucatan came from an asteroid, a giant asteroid hitting into the Yucatan, destroying much of 95% of life on the planet. So we don't choose our conditions, but it's within those conditions that we have to figure out what we can do about it. And fortunately, this is not a class on solving those problems. Yes.
The Greeks might have said there'll always be barbarians around. The hoi barbaroi.
What?
There'll always be barbarians around.
Oh.
But they refer to as the hoi barbaroi.
Yeah. Well, they would, but for the Greeks, that was just people. That was just people who didn't speak Greek. I mean, but the problems that wasn't really a denigration per se of them that much. A little, mildly, but anyway, let's get back now. We're getting to the Unitarianism. So one thing that's fascinating to see is the transformation that takes place in the West. And it is really remarkable. I was watching this recently. They had a special on PBS. Ken Burns did a special on Leonardo da Vinci, which I don't know if you saw it when it showed. I just saw it the last week, etc. But what I wanted to point out is the fascinating thing is the significance of the year 1500, really, symbolically, as a transformation in Western civilizations. In some ways, it's the end of Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern world. Not just a number, right, in one sense, but then you start thinking about it, and you start thinking about what was happening, right? And you have the beginning as a function of, basically as a function of the Ottoman conquest of Byzantium in 1453. You have this, which undermined the capacity of the West to trade with the Middle East. You really pushed this effort to try and find a way to avoid the Ottoman Turks in the middle, and to find a different way to get to the Far East. And that led to the, contributed significantly, as it were, it didn't actually lead to the development of navigation, Portuguese navigation, going around the African coast and going and then developing, and of course then the led to the search to find an alternate way, which led Columbus going the wrong direction, and the discovery of the New World, 1492. Just think of the years, though. You start thinking that Leonardo, who was born in 1452 and died in 1519. Well, who did Leonardo is at work there in Florence? He interacts with Machiavelli, who writes The Prince in 1513. He's interacting and competing with Michelangelo and Raphael, right? Active and at work at that time, though Leonardo didn't interact with him, of course, was Erasmus and the development of humanism. I use Erasmus as an example of that. The humanistic tradition begins somewhat earlier. You can date it with Petrarch and Boccaccio in the 14th century, but it's developing. It's developing along with the development of the Italian city-states, very similar development to what classical Greece, relatively small, self-contained city-states, the center of commerce and trade, at war with one another continually, but really generating a remarkably vital cultural and intellectual life, right? And then, of course, you have shortly thereafter Martin Luther attacking the 95 Theses to the church in Wittenberg in 1517, and the development of the so-called Protestant Reformation, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Well, remarkable period of transformation within that. I just listed key. I mean, it's a really remarkable transformation, and it's the beginning also, right, of an opening up of commercial activity, and which expands into industrial activity mediated by the development of the scientific revolution, which really is a development of the late 16th century. I mean, obviously, Copernicus is 1543, publication of the revolution of the heavenly orbs. But of course, the major efforts of the scientific revolution is the 17th century, right? And that development of the 17th century, from Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes to, through Harvey and the circulation of the blood, and Boyle on the gases, and ultimately, of course, culminating in a certain sense in Isaac Newton, and Gottfried Leibniz also. The whole 17th century, that transformation is part and parcel of a beginning emergence of industrialization, the development of technology. And really, the only thing I think that really can account for the very strange phenomena from which we all benefit directly, the universal priority of the English language, right? Because somehow this little island, historically totally insignificant, even at 1500, right, somehow becomes the ruling power in the world by certainly with the Spanish Armada, 1588, then into the 17th, and by the 18th century, it's in some sense dominating the world, and throughout the 19th century until World War I actually brings it clattering down, and it's on its way back to third world status at the present time, I suspect. Yes, Peter.
I would maintain we'd be speaking German if the Allies hadn't won World War II.
Well, that's
Internationally.
that's entirely possible, but the Allies did win World War II because of the United States and the fantastic power of the American economy.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean I don't want to do counterfactual history, which is a fascinating thing to do, and it's a great operation for the imagination because it's impossible to do in practice. But like what would have happened had Lincoln not been shot? Oh, it's impossible to figure that one out. But anyway, the point is that radical transformation is directly relevant to Unitarianism. What you have is the development of a capitalist economy fueling industrial development, okay, which really is systematically and pervasively transforming the daily life of people. It starts with the scientific revolution. I mean, nobody knows what's going on there except a few scientists who are communicating with each other. Even the Enlightenment of the 18th century is really taking place among a relatively small number of people. The vast majority of people are continuing to live in the same way, but slowly, it's working its way into the conscious and into the practices. All right. And with the development, therefore, of an expanding economy, what does that mean? That means a whole new way of thinking about how we produce and how we distribute, and how we consume, and how we evaluate what we do. And there is a reason why we pay so much attention to Adam Smith's The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776. Right, is in a certain sense a culmination of a critique of more traditional fixed modes of production and distribution based on tradition, based on obviously agriculture, but the landed aristocracy, and based on the effort to preserve and protect that and the historical traditions. So what happens is you have this transformation. And in the late 17th century, there's this whole conflict between the ancients and the moderns. Up until then, it was always thought that what was ancient was much more important, significant. It was revelatory. It was what, we look back to the revelations, the divine revelations, the revelations of our ancestors, right? But what slowly at the end of the 17th century began to say, those ways of thinking and the inherited authority of the past is systematically being critiqued and undermined in the name of what? Rationality, practicality, right? The effort to use rational analysis and thought to evaluate strategies on the basis of their consequences, right? In a sense, their consequences. So there's an economic and social and cultural transformation that's going on in the West, right? And it is radically transforming the conditions of life of the vast majority of people, but is also radically transforming the way people think and evaluate. That finds expression in what is often called modern philosophy, the development of modern philosophy. The development of modern philosophy, often located with the thought of René Descartes, for example, 1596 to 1650, but it's also clearly the thought of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon is, I think it's 1543, I'm not sure, but dies in 1626. Right? And it's Francis Bacon whose image is central to the creation, to the creation and celebration of the scientific academy that's created in England in 1660, the first really scientific academy, right? And academy is not quite the right word, but in which is coming together of scientific resources of Britain. And then, of course, shortly thereafter, the French follow suit, and then the Germans follow suit thereafter, recognizing the fantastic potential for economic development. That's military power, that's economic power, that's social well-being, but it is also social transformation. And what happens in that period of time is therefore this development of an interesting kind of tension in two different traditions emerge in the Western philosophical tradition, which is really, by the way, I think you might say, that has been the motor force for the creation of the modern world. It's now worldwide. It's now, right, but it really is started in Western Europe. And it started in this period of time, in the Italian city-states first, but much more significantly after the Ottoman closing down of the trade to the West, it really was picked up by the Portuguese and the Spanish, and ultimately by the British and the French. Right? Ultimately, Northern Europe is really the economic engine for this transformation. Then it moves eastward and southward over time into the 20th century. So that philosophical transformation, which is really where we're getting to utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism emerges out of this process of rationalization of social interaction, right? So yeah, the Bentham is part of Jeremy Bentham. The major figure here, of course, is Jeremy Bentham. Secondarily, James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, and then we'll get to John Stuart Mill later. And then there is a whole tradition here. But it's important to see that as part and parcel of a transformation of the way in which we think about the world, and the way in which we understand the world, and we try to find our place in it. So there are two different strands that sort of war with each other, but interact with each other in this process, which is often oversimplified as the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalist way, emphasizing the centrality of reason, really focuses upon the fantastic power of mathematics as a model of it, and the capacity of the human mind in developing its mathematical capacities, and more than that, its rational and logical capacities to organize and structure experience in systematic and coherent fashion. So that so-called rational tradition, rationalist tradition, philosophically, that's associated particularly classically with René Descartes, and then with Baruch Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, and then Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who died in 1714. Those are the three major figures. There are many others, obviously, in a tradition which emphasizes the centrality of rationality and of mathematics, and the mathematization of science and of the natural world. And of course, the practical culmination of that is, of course, Newton's Principia Mathematica of 1687, and his development, along with Leibniz, and they were at war for prestige over that issue, never fully resolved as to who had priority and deserved priority for the development of the calculus. Right? But it starts with Descartes, and showing that you can algebraize geometry, because up until then, geometry was a descriptive science, right? And it's Cartesian geometry. That's showing how you can turn it into numbers. And then, of course, Descartes didn't have the calculus, but Newton gives you the calculus, which allows you to deal with motion in a way which Descartes couldn't adequately. That's a radical transformation in thought, and the power of that, and the ability of that to explain and describe, obviously, the motion of the heavens, the universal motion of all falling bodies on the earth. Newton didn't know why that happened. For years, there was this struggle between the Cartesians and the Newtonians, because Descartes wanted to get rid of all of these occult causes which were operating in the medieval world, satirized by Molière, right, on the question of why does opium put people to sleep or have that effect? It has a dormitive virtue. Well, that tells you nothing. It's just using a word to describe a description, to provide a word to explain. Just doesn't explain anything. It's just another way of referring to the power of opium. But why is it doing that? Who the hell knows? Well, the Cartesians said, no, the only way we can understand this world now is if we see material bodies engaging in interaction with other material bodies. It's a development of this mechanism, but it's very practical oriented. That's Descartes. So how do things interact? Because they get hit by other things, like billiard balls is a good example, right? Well, along comes Newton and he gives us, law of universal gravitation. What does that say? It says there's instantaneous influence between the sun and the earth. I mean, the Cartesians said, that's hocus pocus. What do you mean? How does that, what's going on? Instantaneous influence makes no damn sense. It just bringing back these occult causes, the Cartesian said. And Newton's response was, I'm just describing it. The famous expression is, I don't feign hypotheses. I don't make up hypotheses. I don't know why it's happening. In fact, Newton actually thought that this was God's sensorium and God was doing it. But Newton was not a scientist in our modern world. He was deeply part of the Christian world. He was actually Unitarian. Had to keep that quiet because he would have been out of a job and out of business. You couldn't be a Unitarian in England in 1680 or 1690. Head of the Royal Society, that was created in 1660. Newton was a leader of the Royal Society for a while. I mean, you couldn't be that and have any official position and be a Unitarian. You had to be a member of the Church of England. So he had to keep that to himself. So he spent most of his time later in his life doing biblical chronology and trying to understand, the whole question of, how God could carry out and ensure gravity. But in fact, he had no explanation, right? You have to wait till Einstein or in the modern world to get some explanation for how you have instantaneous action at a distance, which in fact you don't have. It's not instantaneous, but that's something they didn't know at the time. But that fight goes on because the Cartesians, in leading this rational revolution, say, you can only deal with what you can see. And we don't want to have these causes made up out of people's heads. We want to deal with what we can see, and we want to be evaluating it on the basis of what effects it has, because that's what really is going to matter. And then the Newtonians give you an alternative way of dealing with, well, I can describe things, and it describes the way the world actually operates, but I can't explain to you why it's the case. Right? And I don't make it up as I go along, but that's good enough because it's practically useful. So you begin to get the sense that it doesn't really matter whether you can say why it is happening. You can say what is happening. You can describe what is happening. And therefore you can use that theory not only to describe what has happened, but you can control what will happen. Right? And it increases your capacity to control the consequences. And so that's practically profoundly useful. And what matters is then what you can do with it. On the other side, in tension, but not really in opposition, are those who say, wait a second, we don't want these occult causes. We want to base things on what we really know. And what we really know is what we encounter and experience. So the empirical tradition, celebrated by Francis Bacon initially, and empirically, philosophically, the key figures of that are John Locke and George Berkeley, and then David Hume are the classic exponents of the so-called empiricist tradition. There are, of course, many others, of which, in some ways, Adam Smith was besides being a close friend of David Hume, was also a member, are ones who want to focus on what our experience, in fact, shows. Right? That we want to ground our theories on what we encounter in our experience, saying that the only thing we know in our minds that we can trust is that which has come to us from experience, the sensations. and the coordination of those sensations that they get associated together in our minds, out of which we develop generalized ideas, and we coordinate those ideas in accordance with their practical relevance to our daily experience. So that sense there of the empirical, the practical, as that all knowledge comes from experience, and anything that goes beyond experience is not to be relied upon, not to be trusted. All right, it's also central part of this scientific revolution. But both of them, in an important sense, get their payoffs by how they produce concrete theories which allow people to organize experience and reconstruct it in ways that produce consequences that enhance the quality of human life to some extent. Right? It's an increased sense of power. Bacon is quite explicit about that. So is Descartes. And in some sense, all of them are in different ways. That knowledge, I think it was Bacon who actually said, knowledge is power. Right? Knowledge is the ability to understand, but it's the ability to control, to guide and direct our experience. Right? It's in that context that what begins to happen is a radical transformation in the very conception of nature and what is natural and the natural world. That's the hidden story. Up until the 17th century, in the West, and that's what we're really talking about here, we're not talking about China or India or Africa, very different stories. Right? Basically, the West saw the world through Christian eyes. And in Christian eyes, primarily, the dominant interpretation, there were other versions, but the dominant one by far was this was a fallen world because of original sin. This was a fallen world. And human beings are pervaded by original sin. Right? I mean, the best example of that, of course, theoretically, best, I mean, in terms of the clearest, the most articulate, it's John Calvin. It's in Luther clearly too. It goes all the way back, and it's in St. Augustine. But right? I mean, Augustine is the one who really formulates initially, right, that you can't even do anything yourself to save yourself. We're all so corrupted in our essential nature that we are totally incapable of saving ourselves. The only thing that can save us is divine grace. And we have no right to it. We can't demand it or expect it. It's God's freely given to those who he chooses to give. To those who he will save, and to those who he will condemn to eternal damnation, he will condemn to eternal damnation. And we can never know fully who it is, but we have no say in the matter. And Calvin is quite explicit about that. And the Puritans were very clear about that. You can read, because America's founded by Calvinists, by and large, different versions. Right? There are exceptions. I mean, you have the Catholics founding Baltimore and Maryland, Lord Baltimore. You have different versions of it in the South, in South Carolina and Georgia, but primarily and most poignantly, right? Certainly in New England, and in different ways in the Dutch and even with the Quakers. But fascinating. You just look at the one simple example: child rearing among the Puritans. They'd wait till about the 10 months. By about 10 months, the first thing that what you had to do by then is then begin to drive the evil out of the child. It was not nurturing. Puritan child rearing was not nurturing. It was obviously done from their sense of affection and care and concern for their child. If the child was going to be saved, you had to drive that original sin out of them. because all of our natural impulses are selfish, self-directing, and essentially unchristian, to say the least. We are by nature sick, evil people. That's pervasive, right? That's pervasive. You go, I mean, you go to stories of what was the Christian response during the Great Plagues of the 14th century, right? Self-flagellation. We deserved it. We brought it upon ourselves. We must punish ourselves enough so that God will recognize that we own the evil and the suffering, and then he will ease his just punishments to us, which was the plague. But that's just one example of it. And then you see the practical versions of it when you read about Puritan child rearing in the United States in 1640, 1650. But how do you drive the evil out of the child, starting when he's 10 months old? Right? Nature was corrupted, right? And that's pervasive until beginning in the middle of the 17th century. You begin to have a different sense of the natural emerging. It's really radical. And you have people coming along, Christians saying, this world was God's creation. God is basically good. God could not be making evil things if he's basically good. If we have natural desires and drives, and if God put them there, they must be good. And therefore, and he must want us to satisfy them. No, that was heretical initially, yes.
Great figure in that, not well studied, is Roger Williams. The man in that transition from the Puritanism you're talking about, the new sense of nature, and his recognition, for instance, of the indigenous people as equal and not agents of the devil.
Yeah. And he founded the city with a strange name, Providence. If you think about its name and what it means, but it was the Puritans referred to it as not Rhode Island, but Rogues Island.
That was Rhode Island and Providence plantations, actually.
Yeah.
Rhode Island was in the south.
Yeah, well, he was driven out of Boston.
Because he didn't accept that.
Well, he's a more complicated story because Roger Williams didn't want any mixture of church and state. Not because he was afraid that the state would impress the church, but he didn't want, not because he didn't want the church, to dominate the state, but because he figured the state would corrupt the church. He wanted total independence of the church and state, because, but in some sense, he was so much of an individualist that ultimately it was impossible to stay in a community, because if you really follow, as he did, and Ann Hutchison, who unfortunately had an accident on the Hutchison River Parkway. It's where the Indians put her and her children to death in 1643. This tremendous emphasis on the individual relation of the self to God meant that each person was in some sense a source of authority themselves. And that means that the possibility of communal authority was impossible. So that was obviously something which the authorities in Plymouth and in Boston couldn't accept, but in some sense, which she and Roger Williams had tremendous difficulty maintaining any community. It ended up being a community of one in Roger Williams's case.
Roger Williams, I think, was a pivotal figure.
Yeah, but I mean, but he's not a pivotal figure on the question of the inherent evil of human nature. All right, and that notion remains. That's a process that takes place over about 100 years. The struggle to, in some sense, transform the conception of the natural, and to see the natural as we think now, many, right? We, and the whole, health movements and all, celebrate the natural somehow, as if it's somehow divine. Right? I mean, that's a little strange too. That's the other version of it, right? As if cancer isn't natural, for example. But the celebration of the natural, but that conception would be inconceivable in the 17th and earlier, right? The transformation of how we understand the natural, and therefore the beginning to believe that our desires, our natural hopes and aspirations, our natural inclinations are not intrinsically evil. They are either, they are just, they have no moral valence, but usually more so that they are basically God-given, becomes what emerges. You begin to develop a Christian utilitarianism, namely, and this happens to be in the 17th century in England, late 1600s, right? Begin to have Christian thinkers saying our natural desires are good, they are God-given, and God, if God put them there, he meant them to have them, he meant us to use them and to fulfill them, right? So you get a Christian development. And then it emerges into something which is often called the moral sense school, saying that human beings have by nature a fellow feeling, a sense of compassion for others. And this develops into the moral theory of the 18th century, which had a big role in the United States, but is really developed in England. And people like Francis Hutchinson, for example, is a classic figure, or the third Earl of Shaftesbury is another classic figure. And it finds expression in the moral theory of Adam Smith, who before he writes the Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 17 years earlier, in 1759, he produces a theory of moral sentiments. And the notion is that we are naturally devoted, we are naturally inclined to fellow feeling, to a concern for the well-being of others. We get satisfaction when we see people who deserve to do well, doing well, and people who don't deserve to do well, not doing well, that there's a natural fellow feeling. Well, that's a very different sense. There's somehow that we have a natural sense of concern for others didn't exist in the 17th century. For example, I mean, you can see that, by the way. You want to check this out in very practical sense. Read the maxims of La Rochefoucauld, who writes in 1670, right, the time of Molière, the time of Louis XIV, and you'll see how he understands human motivation, and it's all selfishness through and through, right? Another famous novel of that time, which encapsulates this vision profoundly, the Princess de Clèves, the French novel, right? Classic of the 18th century. Selfishness is taken for granted as the very nature of the human being. And so that's a naturalization of original sin. And the theoretical expression of that selfishness finds its really classic expression in the brilliant thought of Thomas Hobbes, who was totally not a religious thinker in a Christian sense, however he uses the language, and he writes beautifully and tries to cover up the atheism which is pervasive in Hobbes. And Hobbes was born, as he said, in the year of the Spanish Armada, 1588, and dies in 1588 to 1679, I think. He lived to be 91. But Hobbes, that sense of the nature of human beings and human motivation, Hobbes is the one who said that human life is a war of all against all, in which the life of man, in that brilliant phrase, is poor, mean, nasty, brutish, and short. a brilliant Hobbesian expression. The life of man is poor, mean, nasty, brutish, and short. And that leads to his development of the social contract theory for rational, practical self-interest. So you begin to see the rational practicality. The social contract theory is developed, but it's developed based on the inherent selfishness of the human being. But it develops as a rational and a-religious, you would say. It's not anti-religious. It's just rational and non-religiously based, not antagonistic to religion, but non-religiously based, but rational explanation of how social societies, what legitimates society, not how they were brought to get into being, because no one really thought that the social contract really happened as it described. It's a as if, which says, but it's to present a rational justification, and in so doing, present the kind of structure we need in society in order to make human life possible, and where possible, rewarding. From Hobbes' point of view, the main effort is to stop civil war, to stop the destruction, which is human beings being at each other's throats, which he thinks is the essential condition of human beings. So that's there he is he is giving expression to the historical Christian vision, but it's de-religious, de-theologized, all right? But the notion that human beings are intrinsically selfish, and that human life is a war of all against all, in which the life of man is poor, mean, nasty, brutish, and short. Solitary, poor, mean, nasty, brutish, and short. But, I mean, but you can give a smoother version of that social contract theory, as John Locke does, who's religious, right? So he doesn't see the human condition clearly as negative as Hobbes did, but Locke comes later, and he's in this process in which the conception of the natural is undergoing this transformation. Right? So Hobbes dies in 1679, did I say? I think that's right. Locke lives from 1732 to 1804, I think. 1802, 1804, thereabouts. So Locke is a little later. Locke has got a more positive sense of human nature and our capacity to live with one another. So he develops a milder conception of the social contract, in which basically the government is like an administrator of a corporation, okay, who's going to look out for the property of its stockholders. It's essentially what it comes down to. Right? Right? And we bring the government in. The society agrees to create a government to look after our well-being, right? But the government is constrained by the intrinsic values, which are in some sense God-given, to be respectful for one another, to respect individuals' property. Well, basically life, liberty, and property. Right? I mean, that's where Jefferson got the idea. He changed the last one in his much more progressive version to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it was Locke. Life, liberty, and property is the rationale for government. And you need that, otherwise people can't really manage their own affairs collectively in a reliable way, but they're not as vicious as Christians had thought intrinsically, or as even Hobbes in his naturalized version had thought. They're capable of rationality. They're capable of fellow feeling. They're just not capable of being impartial judges in their own affairs. They need an impartial judge. They need an appropriate legal structure. But the role of that legal structure is to look out for and to preserve and protect life, liberty, and property. And when they fail to do that, you have a right to get rid of them because they have failed on their responsibility. So it's a justification, in general, of revolution. in practice of the glorious revolution of 1680, 88 and 89 in Britain. So you have this big transformation of the conception of the natural, but you still have this sense of, well, how do we understand human motivation? Right? How do we understand human motivation? And this sense that human beings are by nature selfish. It's a long history. It continues to this present day among many people. Right? And it's still endemic in the Christian tradition, in the ways in which I don't think it is in the Islamic or the Judaic tradition. I don't claim to be any experts of that. But it is endemic in the Christian tradition, certainly the doctrine of original sin. So this is the context, right? The transformation of the natural means that it's okay to satisfy human desires. This slowly morphs, right, into what becomes one of the central utilitarian doctrines. That people basically are motivated by the desire to satisfy their desires and to minimize their sufferings. And Bentham has a very simple, and here it's very consistent with the scientific revolution's development of mechanism, materialism, and atomism, really, essentially. For Newton, it was a corpuscular theory, but it's basically atomism, right? That the material world interacts, and we just have to understand the rules and regulations of the interaction of the material world. Well, that's appropriated by Bentham, and the atom becomes each individual human being, right? Part of it emerging individualism. There's a real interesting history of individualism. Individualism in the 17th century, well, think of it in Shakespeare, because we all know Shakespeare, right? The individual in Shakespeare is always evil. To pursue your individual interest is evil. And the great Shakespearean evil figures, Richard III, Iago, the individualists, and they're self-satisfied in pursuing their own self-interest without respect for their obligations and responsibilities. Shakespeare is a pre-modern writer, brilliant as he is. I mean, his worldview is Aristotelian, is the pre-Copernican world. You'll see that. You see that. I think most explicitly, I think, is in Troilus and Cressida. But it's the Christian world, the pre-Copernican world, and it's the world of hierarchy and order. Right, the king is the appropriate role of the king, the appropriate role of the tradition, right? And individualism is seen as an evil, disruptive force, and that is truth. That's part of the entire Christian tradition for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, 1,500 years. I mean, oversimplified from 0 to 1,500. If we think of it, it's not quite true that way. All right. Say Christianity dominates from 500 to 1,500, roughly. All right. But there's a transformation of the very conception of the individual as part of this conception of what is natural. And slowly there's the merging breakdown of the medieval tradition, hierarchical tradition. And it in some sense, it happens in the church first with the Protestant Reformation, which is the individual. We just talk about it in terms of Roger Williams, or Anne Hutchinson. That comes a little later. But it's the sense that the individual has direct insight and doesn't have to be impeded by or subordinated to the role of the church as the mediator, right? And that's what's central to Luther, the priesthood of all believers. because each person has a direct access. The Bible is to be made available to everybody. And that was not true in the Catholic Church. People were not encouraged to read the Bible. They were encouraged to listen to the way the church interpreted the meaning and significance of it, based on its interpretation of the major church conclaves. But no, there's the printing press, which comes off from Gutenberg in 1453. And then all of a sudden there's this flowering of publications, and most centrally, Luther, the translation of the Bible into the vernacular. That was not to be done. When Wycliffe does it in England, he's got to run for his life. You don't translate the Bible into the vernacular. But of course, I mean, not only does Luther do it, right? And that is then also, of course, does Erasmus do it, and many others do it. And increasingly it's been made available. This is the encouragement, each individual to read the Bible and to direct an individual personal relation with the divine.
How does the Inquisition deal with the thought of the evil of man?
They put them on, they burn them at the stake.
To anybody that wasn't Christian.
Well, I mean, the ones don't get burned to the stake are the ones who accept the legitimate teachings and follow what the church tells them they should do. Of course, there's also a purification notion that's taking place here. That means, so you're getting rid of it. I mean, the Spanish killed themselves. I mean, destroyed themselves as a civilization. They got rid of the Arabs and they got rid of the Jews.
That wasn't evil? What
Well,
they
I'm
did?
not, you asking me to make a judgment? Or you're asking Torquemada to make the judgment?
The latter.
Well, no, that was a complicated situation. It was part of the consolidation of the nation state of Spain from the first driving the Moors, the Muslims out of Spain, and that's a several 100-year project, right? And then the notion that you had to have, in order to have a coherent political order, you had to have a coherent theological order. You couldn't have diversity. Diversity was a political threat. It was treasonous. There was a dogma, and that dogma was the truth to which you ought to have subscribed. And if you didn't do that, you were actually in rebellion against the society. So it's ethnic cleansing, that's clear, but it's ethnic cleansing as dictated by the conception of what is necessary for domestic order and political order. And then it becomes a big struggle. I mean, so
That's always
the notion of pluralism, which, by the way, is still something we have tremendous difficulty with in the modern world. I say we, meaning the human species, right? And not necessarily individuals necessarily here, but, right, I mean, and most societies are in different degrees of uncomfortable with too much pluralism, okay? All right, I mean, obviously the problems of immigration, there's many dimensions to that, but one clearly is people who look and act and behave and are different from us, and we don't want too many of them here. And I say that it doesn't matter where you are. I mean, that's probably, you can say that for almost every culture in the world, and it doesn't matter what culture they are. They can be, white Anglo-Saxon Christians in Texas, or they can be black, Africans in the center of Nigeria, with respect to the tribe next door. It doesn't seem to be a great deal different.
Maybe in Europe, but our country was founded differently. We're new, right? And our country was all men. It's supposed to be all men are created equal.
Well, I mean, yeah,
all men aren't created equal.
yeah, but it wasn't that originally. I mean, the Puritans didn't come here to have religious freedom. The Puritans came here to get away from religious freedom. They had religious freedom in Leiden, in Netherlands, and that was a threat to their ability to indoctrinate their children the values they wanted. They said, we got to get out of here. We got out of England because they were imposing Anglicism on us. We want to purify the British church. We had to get out of there. We went over to the Netherlands. The Netherlands allowed us to believe whatever we wanted to believe as long as we kept it to ourselves. you know, that they, I mean, that was the whole story with Spinoza and the Jews. I mean, they were great. We fine to believe in Yahweh and the Jew. Just keep it to yourself and carry on the business. But don't let people get like Spinoza, who starts raising questions about those things, right? Well, I mean, for the Puritans, though, they said, well, this is a disaster for our education of our kids, right? There's too much freedom. We want to get to a place where we can impose our values. So they came here, not for religious freedom, but for their religious freedom to oppose on. And, you know, when the Quakers came into New England, you know what happened to them? Well, a couple of them were hung up. All right, they came back, and finally they strung them up because they said we don't allow that here, and that's why they drove Roger Williams and they drove, you know, Ann Hutchinson out, because they had a real sense of what was the appropriate order in which the community of saints were to rule. That's the way they referred to themselves. So you know, why people came here is a complicated story, and part of it was overpopulation in England. Well, it's, you know, it's relative overpopulation given the economic status, the situation of England at the time. Yeah, yeah.
So Penn came to establish, take care of the Quakers. So the founding of this country, as you're pointing out, is not 1776, but it's these early actions. And the early action saw this continent as a vast area. For that matter, because of its vastness,
Yeah.
you could establish new islands for various religious identities.
Mhm.
In Maryland, the Catholics could arrive, and in Pennsylvania,
The
the
Quakers.
Quakers,
Yeah.
etc. Even though they dominated most of Long Island at one point, the Hicks family owned most of
Mhm.
what we see as nice little villages.
Right, yeah. But anyway, so I want to, because we have a little time, I want to get more specifically to the Unitarians, but utilitarians, not Unitarians, utilitarians, in the context. But it's so important to see what is happening, what is now the merges. And Bentham is the embodiment of this in a brilliant way, right? He's trying to rationalize moral thinking, and his real focus is really political and legal reform of the whole question of the criminal justice system. But it's say, what's the purpose of criminal justice system, right? It's to reform people. It's to stop crime and to improve the capacity of these people to, where possible, to assume a constructive place in society, right? But the punishment should be related to the objectives, right? And so what is it that is the framework for this moral theory that he develops? Well, he says, all right, we have to really apply our rational and scientific understanding to the society, to the organization and restructuring of society. I mean, the traditions that are just negated to us from the past, right? The hierarchical traditions, the celebration of lords and ladies and different kinds of royalty with responsibilities and obligations. These are all relics of the past, which no longer constructively contribute to the society and to its humans, to its well-being. Right? Yes, he did believe that people were basically selfish. So he's still within that context of what we call psychological hedonism. People are basically looking out for their own well-being. He does see individuals as really simply nuggets, as it were, of selfishness. Right? But he thinks that selfishness can be marshaled, can be coordinated, can be organized. And that's the same notion that Adam Smith has in The Wealth of Nations. And again, the timing is exactly the same. Bentham is, his years are 1748 to 1832. All right. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations is 1760 1776. Bentham's major writings are the last part of the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century. The central doctrine of the central book of Bentham's is the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789. So he's part of this emerging individualism, which is a whole new thing now, right? It's a complicated process that emerges in which, beginning with the Protestant Reformation in many ways, celebrating the solitary individual there in relation to God, increasingly as a kind of social interpretation of the scientific understanding of atomism and of the world is made up of material particles. The society is made up of individuals. What is society? Just a group of individuals, each one motivated similarly by the desire, says Bentham feels, to maximize his pleasure and to minimize his pain. So selfishness really is still a motivating force for the individuals in Bentham's view. Right? But rationality is the key criteria, or the key instrument better here, right? To understand how to organize those individuals. We ought to apply that rationality, which has developed in the scientific revolution and showed its effectiveness in the development of technology, in the advancement of commerce, and increasing emerging development of industry. And industry is really, really beginning. Manufacturing is really beginning in the 18th century. You all remember from elementary school, the spinning jenny, right? And of course the steam engine. So all these 18th century and technological inventions in England. We're explaining why England, for strange reasons, becomes this world power. This little island off the coast of Europe becomes the world power for several hundred years. It's itself a strange, interesting phenomenon. Right. But the rationality's power, practical power, shown by science and technology and commerce and industry, and given expression with an emerging and new class. Which class? The class of we call the middle class. Basically the new emerging mercantile class of traders and then businessmen. Right? The vast majority of people living in horrendous conditions. There's no question about that. Just, read. I guess Charles Dickens is the best one, but he's a little later. He's the 19th century. The conditions of life of the working people were not very good. But there was an increasing standard of living, increasingly more so in the 19th century than in the 18th century. Right. And but the conditions of life were improving because the production was rapidly increasing as a function of the application of rationality and technology to the conditions of life. And so that conception was working its way through the intellectual world, right? And it's working its way as a way of understanding the social world, right? So the individualism, still the sense of the human selfishness, but with a sense that all of our knowledge comes from experience. So I'm going to talk more next time about the whole notion of associational psychology, the way our ideas get created and developed, right, in the human being, but all of us experiencing our ideas through the senses and being associated in the mind through resemblance and contiguity in space and time. Those are the principles that supposedly are operating, that give us the more generalized ideas, which we can then organize and coordinate and put to practical use naturally for our own selfish well-being. Right? The notion of utility is a way of giving expression to the fact that the satisfaction coming from good consequences is legitimate. That's the transformation of the natural. So it's nothing wrong with our natural desires being satisfied. And our natural desires are most clearly expressed in those things which give us pleasure, and pain being the negative of that. So that from Bentham's point of view, all human beings simply want to maximize their pleasure, minimize their pain, and they're motivated by these selfish desires, but they have the rational capacity to understand, organize, and reorganize the society. And we need to put that to work in such a way as to enhance our well-being. The challenge then becomes, how do we transform our selfish desires so that we are taking into consideration what is in the best interest of everybody? There's a real problem in Bentham's thought. Because the utilitarian notion is, right, that we seek to maximize our pleasure, minimize our pain. That's the criteria of what is good. What is good is pleasure. What is bad is pain. Who are they good for or bad for? The individual. The individual is the unit whose well-being is the central concern of ethics. The central concern of ethics is the well-being of the individual. And the individual wants to maximize their pleasure. They want to minimize their pain. They live in society, but for Bentham, society is nothing but a whole bunch of individuals. Right? But the moral obligation that we have is to promote the general happiness, to maximize the pleasure of society. That means to maximize the pleasure of all individuals. But the question, the practical question is, well, wait a second, but how do we get selfish individuals to give a damn about the well-being of the society at large? Now, that means really just for Bentham, just all the other individuals or any other individuals. That's something, by the way, theoretically, he doesn't resolve. Right? But if people are by nature selfish, how do you get selfish individuals to care about? So Bentham's moral framework is, and this is the framework of utilitarianism, what really matters is the consequences of our action. Rationality is a way of understanding the world. It goes back to your question initially. Rationality is understanding where we are so as to know how we're going to go where we should be. But where should we be, says Bentham? Where we should be is to bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's a famous utilitarian notion. To promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number, with each person counting as one and nobody counting as more than one. Well, that's nice. Wait a second, but where does that come in if people are by nature selfish? Well, Bentham doesn't solve that problem theoretically. Let me just give you a clue in there, okay? That's something that John Stuart Mill is who is the greatest philosophical thinker of the British culture of the 19th century by far, and he's a fascinating person, and we'll talk about him next time, tries to address that. We're going to talk about John Stuart Mill. He's a fascinating, very beautiful, decent human being in many ways, and a very important thinker. And he tries to take the utilitarian framework, and he was born into it, literally born into it. I mean, Bentham's major assistant, you might say, in the development of utilitarianism was James Mill, Bentham, John Stuart's father. And we'll talk about the famous education of John Stuart Mill next time. But what we see then is the naturalization of value, right? And that the value is experienced by human beings and experienced as pleasure. Pleasure meaning the satisfaction of our nature. There's nothing wrong with our nature. That's no longer the Christian world. This is the post-Christian world, right? Our nature is not evil inherently. We are not condemned by original sin. Right? So the naturalization, the positive orientation to nature means that the satisfaction of that is intrinsically good. And the notion of utility, and hence utilitarianism, is we should use our rational and scientific capacity, right, to maximize, very quantitative, not qualitative. There's no judgment here about different pleasures. All right? Pleasure is pleasure. Responding to our own, to our natural wants, needs, desires. No judgment about that from Benson's point of view. Whatever it is that, whatever naturally we want or desire is as equally good as anyone else's, right? But the satisfaction of that is what is positive. Suffering is what is negative. Pleasure and pain are simple and quantitative. And he, in fact, develops what he calls the philosophic calculus, very appropriate in the scientific world, drawn from the calculus of Newton and Leibniz, but he's going to do a philosophic calculus as a way to evaluate and calculate in a purely rational and practical sense, as if he was running a business enterprise. So you have an objective scientific determination of what is the right thing to do. Here, his ethics becomes science, becomes practical science, just like Smithian economics. So, you know, in a certain sense, the calculus here, the philosophic, meaning pleasurable, calculus, right, is like our modern cost-benefit analysis, right? You can see the similarity. In economics, we do a cost-benefit analysis. In ethics, Jeremy Bentham does a philosophic calculus. And the criteria, I shall read them here since I want to try and play them up in our mind. Here we have them. Let's see here, the philosophic calculus. His complete list is the following. These are the things to consider, and you want to mathematically calculate, weigh them as it were, so that you can get the greatest amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain for the greatest number, with everyone to be counted as one and nobody to count as more than one. The pleasure, the intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty of the pleasure, propinquity or remoteness, fecundity, purity, and extent. Extent meaning how many people are included. Purity is it mixed with pains? I mean, you could say, like, you know, going to the dentist, for example, or something. You know, you get pleasure in some sense, but you have some pain to get through it. Okay. So those are the criteria. All right. Those are the qualities that are considered, but they're all to be quantized. It's not quantum mechanics yet. We're well before that, but quantized. And then Bentham conceived of this as a scientific and practical way that rationally you could evaluate what was the right thing to behave or the wrong thing to do. And that means the right thing to develop the social policies and the wrong thing. And he was particularly concerned with prison reform, for example. And you do, what kind of punishment is appropriate? What kind of incarceration is appropriate? What kind of penitentiary is appropriate? It's a very important word because it suggests that you're going to have them engage in penitence, but you're not seeking to have them suffer. I don't know the penitentiary would be an appropriate word for the way we treat prisoners these days. It's a appropriate Christian conception, I guess, applied to the prison system. There are many different ways of understanding the purpose of prison, right? But for Bentham, it was clear that the only rational justification of incarceration was to minimize the pain of society and to maximize its pleasure. And the only punishment that's appropriate was the minimal punishment necessary to stop the behavior and in some sense to, as it would, change the behavior of the individuals. Right? That would be the only justification. There was no justification for punishment for the sake of retribution, for the sake of personal satisfaction or revenge.
But deterrence.
Deterrence is an appropriate reason to do it, but only the minimum amount of pain inflicted, because all pain is evil, and you have to justify the infliction of pain The only pain that's justified is the pain, the minimal necessary pain to deter the behavior, which itself has negative consequences. Right? And what makes the behavior need to be deterrent is because the behavior leads to negative pain on the part of others and undermines the other. So Bentham is not, I could say, Bentham is not a subtle, and he's not I even say in many ways, not a sophisticated thinker in some ways. I mean, he's obviously smart, and he was a dedicated social reformer, but he's not one for nuance. Right? And his conception is very simple, that the human being, we're all individuals. He has no sense of society as a collective entity. The notion of groups that have some intrinsic value on their own. No, a group is just really a collection of individuals. So this is metaphysical individualism. Right? Now that's a new thing that develops, by the way. And I want to underline that because it's quite different from celebrating the value of individuality. There's a lot of confusion about that. Individualism as a metaphysical doctrine about the nature of the human being is quite different from a moral doctrine which celebrates promoting the individuality of a person or a people. We'll see John Stuart Mill putting a lot of emphasis on the celebration of the value of individuality, although he remains really a metaphysical individualist. If you come to modern pragmatists, for example, who are also consequentialists, you'll see that they have a very different conception of, let's say, much less of an individualist conception, although they can share the values of individuality. I'm talking about John Dewey, for example. But John Stuart Mill was close to, for a long time, to Alexis de Tocqueville and close to Auguste Comte. Comte is the official founder of sociology, who had a real sense about the autonomous reality of society, of social groupings. Mill was not in agreement with Comte on that. We'll come back to that discussion. But that issue doesn't even arise for Bentham. For Bentham has taken over this notion of the individual in a way in which is not self-conscious. He doesn't really argue for it. He just assumes it, right? It's very different from something that would have happened 100 years earlier, where you had to, where the notion of being an individual is ambiguous. And as I said, in Shakespeare, it's negative. There's just not, to set out to be an individual is to break out of the social order and not know your place. You're disruptive. You're destructive. Right? Why would you do such a thing? The appropriate thing is to find your place and to fulfill your obligations and responsibilities, and to be the ideal of perfect king like Henry V. Right? But that's a pre-modern conception. In the emerging modern conception, you have this emerging of a sense of individualism, which, as I said, really begins in some ways with the Protestant Reformation that happens there in religious contexts. And then and that's totally appropriate to be happening at the same time as you have the emerging business world, and you have the individualism of the emerging wealthy entrepreneur, and you have the celebration of individualism emerging in the Italian city-states. So you can see that happening independently. You see the Leonardo discussion, for example. I mean, Michelangelo has the nerve to put his name on what was it? Was it the David? I think it's on the David that he puts his name. I mean, Middle Ages, you didn't do that. You didn't put your name on something. I mean, that's just a sin of pride, right?
Michelangelo did the David.
Yes, and he put his name on it, I believe. I believe it's on the David. From remembering Ken Burns' show. Yeah, but there's one case where they showed Michelangelo's name he put his name on one of his sculptures. Okay, I think it was on the David. Okay, well, that is, I mean, and by the way, and that's probably just before Martin Luther. I mean, I think the David is in the first decade of the 16th century. Luther's the second decade, so I think it's even before that, right? So that process is happening. The breakdown of the medieval world is happening, all right? And okay, So I think we're sort of coming to a conclusion here of this, just the oversimplification of the utilitarian conception, right, is this, the celebration of pleasure and pain is the criteria, the individual is the bearer, right, and the moral ideal is to maximize the pleasure of the greatest, producing the greatest happiness. But for Bentham, the word happiness simply means the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, with everyone to count as one and no one to count as more than one. That's the vision. Right? Then the question, there's some problems obviously built into that. But we'll pick it up next time, where we'll talk about John Stuart Mill, particularly how he develops that thought and how he develops it into a political theory of liberalism in his brilliant book on liberty, which is really a classic of the Western philosophical tradition. And then maybe some of the challenges to the utilitarian way of interpreting the world. Okay? We'll do that next time. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
David, what do I do when the gentleman across the table covets my lunch?
The gentleman across the table, what do you mean?
Well, I want lunch and he really wants that lunch.
Yeah. Well, what about
Well,
it?
it's a legitimate desire for him.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you can choose to do what you want. You can share with them. I mean, what you do is, there are many possibilities there.
Well, maybe I'll feel good about sharing.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of questions. I think that there are tremendous limitations with respect to Bentham's conception of the human being, and tremendous limitations with Bentham's conception of the nature of society and our relation to it. So and Mill tries to address these in some ways. And I think Mill is a what? Huh?
Bentham also was enough. And
Well, yeah.
and
I
the
got
purest example of that is that cabinet in Wigan.
Yeah.
Is leatherized and body,
Yeah.
seated in the chairman's chair.
It's
It's
Bentham.
rolled out for every meeting
Yeah.
annually.
Yeah.
And
I have-
that was specified by him. He said that had to be done.
Yeah, no, I have that. I had that as part of my notes. I didn't get to talk about it, but yes.
Did you ever?
It says here-
Starting to see that they now have it in a different type of exhibition. They don't
Yeah.
roll it out anymore. He had, his will specified that his body, remember, he was chair of the Royal Society. I forget what the name of the group was, and he specified that his body would be embalmed specially and dressed as it would be when he presided, and kept in the meeting rooms of this society. And in their annual meeting, he would be rolled out and put in the presider's seat.
That's right.
It was his effort, I guess,
Yeah.
at immortality.
Yeah, he created he found-
Head of the.
no, this was before Lenin,
No, I
but
know.
no, it's still there. Yeah, what I have is here, see, I was quoting in some places. Per his instructions, he was dissected, embalmed, dressed, and placed in a chair, and to this day resides in a cabinet in the corridor of the main building of the University College. And I think he's rolled out by the board of trustees meets or something.
Yeah, but they
Yeah.
no longer roll him out. He is in the cabinet,
Okay,
and there's a glass, if you travel to London, you could visit him.
yeah.